"This is HOA rejected," she said encroachment and smiled. Karen waved a complaint email printout and yelled that the board did not need proof beyond feelings. "I care what the bylaws say," I told her, and she ripped the paper in half like that settled anything. She was standing on my driveway holding a tape measure and a clipboard, her face already red, her whistle dangling from a lanyard around her neck. The landing at Harborview Village Association had rules about fence height and setback, and I had followed every single one of them, but Karen decided my fence looked wrong, and that was enough for her to launch a full investigation. I am a Veteran Affairs Benefits Counselor in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I live by paperwork. Every form has to be perfect, or someone loses their housing or health care. I moved into this development 6 months ago because the price was right, and I thought a quiet neighborhood would help me decompress after work. The HOA sent a welcome packet with 73 pages of bylaws, and I read all of them twice. I knew the fence rules before I even called the contractor. Maximum height 6 feet, minimum setback 3 feet from the property line, no chain link, approval required for color and style. I submitted my application in March with photos of the proposed design, a cedar privacy fence stained natural brown. The architectural committee approved it in writing 2 weeks later. I hired a contractor in April, and the fence went up in 3 days. Clean posts, level panels, every measurement double-checked. I even paid extra for a survey so the setback would be exact. The surveyor hammered orange reflective markers into the ground at each corner and ran a string line to mark the boundary. My fence sat exactly 3 feet 2 inches inside my property line. I documented everything with photos and kept the survey report in a binder on my kitchen counter. The HOA requires homeowners to keep records for 5 years, and I was already ahead of the game. Then Melissa Thomas showed up. She was the landscaping committee lead, and she had a reputation for inspecting every shrub and mailbox like she was grading a military base. She wore a pink windbreaker in all weather and carried a white visor in her car so she could deploy it the moment she stepped outside. Her whistle was her signature move. If she saw something she did not like, she blew the whistle twice, and someone from the management company would appear within an hour. I had seen her blow it at a neighbor for parking a work van in his own driveway overnight. The tow truck arrived before sunrise. Melissa walked my fence line the day after installation. She took photos from every angle and measured the height at 6 different points. I watched from my kitchen window as she crouched near the back corner and took a picture from inside my yard, past the fence line into the neighbor's space. I made a note of the time and date. She did not ask permission, and she did not knock on my door to introduce herself. She just trespassed, took her photos, and left. 2 days later, I got a violation notice in the mail. The envelope had the landing at Harborview Village Association printed on the return address, and inside was a single page with a checklist of alleged violations. Fence exceeds maximum height by 4 inches. Fence color not approved. Fence encroaches on common area easement. Fine assessed $100. Due within 14 days. Contact the management company to schedule a hearing if you wish to dispute. I read it 3 times and felt my chest tighten. Every single claim was false. I had the approval letter. I had the survey. I had photos with a tape measure showing the height at 71 inches, but the notice was already official, and the clock was ticking. I called the management company that afternoon. The receptionist put me on hold for 9 minutes, and then transferred me to a compliance coordinator named Derek, who sounded like he was reading from a script. He told me the landscaping committee had the authority to issue corrections based on visual inspections, and that I could request a formal hearing within 10 days. I asked him if the committee had actually measured my fence, or just looked at it and decided it was wrong. He said he could not comment on investigative methods. I asked him if anyone from the HOA had compared my fence to the approval letter I submitted. He said he would pass my concerns along to the committee. Then he hung up. I filed my hearing request the next morning and attached copies of the approval letter, the survey report, and 12 photos showing the fence height and setback measurements. I also attached a photo of Melissa standing inside my property line, taking pictures without permission. I wrote a 2-page response explaining that every claim in the violation notice was factually incorrect, and that I expected the fine to be withdrawn immediately. I sent it certified mail and kept the receipt in the binder with everything else. Melissa showed up at my door 3 days later. She did not ring the doorbell. She knocked hard enough to rattle the frame, and then blew her whistle twice while I was still walking to the door. I opened it, and she was already talking. "Your fence is still wrong, and we are moving forward with enforcement," she said. "The rules do not care about your excuses, and neither do I." I told her I had submitted a hearing request, and that I expected the board to follow its own procedures. She laughed and pulled out her phone. She showed me a photo of my back fence corner taken from an angle that made it look like the panel was tilted forward. "That is a safety hazard," she said. "We could shut this down today if we wanted to." I asked her when she had taken that photo, and she said it did not matter. I told her I had video of her trespassing, and she said she was allowed to inspect common areas. I pointed out that my backyard is not a common area, and she blew the whistle again. Then she walked back to her car and drove away. I knew I was dealing with someone who would twist every rule to fit her narrative. Melissa had decided my fence was a problem, and she was going to manufacture evidence until the board agreed with her. I had seen her do it to other neighbors. She had forced one family to repaint their mailbox 3 times because the shade of black was allegedly not approved. She had cited another neighbor for parking violations every single day for 2 weeks until he sold his truck. She operated on intimidation and volume, and she had the management company backing her up because they did not want to deal with the hassle of questioning her. My insurance carrier sent me an email that same week asking for updated photos of my property. They were reviewing my policy, and they needed proof that I had completed the fence installation and that it met local building codes. I had to respond within 10 days, or they would flag my account for non-compliance and possibly adjust my premium. The timing could not have been worse. I needed to resolve the HOA violation fast, so I could send the insurance company clean documentation, but Melissa was actively creating chaos to delay everything. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I got a confirmation email from the management company with a date and time and a note that said the landscaping committee would present their findings, and I would have 10 minutes to respond. I asked if I could bring a witness, and they said only if the witness was a homeowner in the association. I asked if I could record the meeting, and they said no. I asked if I would receive copies of the committee's evidence in advance, and they said it would be provided at the hearing. Every procedural detail was designed to make it harder for me to defend myself. Melissa escalated 2 days before the hearing. I was in my driveway unloading groceries when she pulled up in her SUV with a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a reflective vest and carrying a long metal ruler that looked like something from a construction site. Melissa pointed at my fence, and the man walked over with the ruler and started measuring the height at random points. I set my groceries down and walked over. I asked who he was, and Melissa said he was an independent inspector hired by the association. I asked if I could see his credentials, and she said I did not have the right to interfere with an official inspection. The man measured 3 panels and wrote numbers on a notepad. Then he took photos with his phone and got back in the SUV with Melissa. They drove off without saying another word. I called the management company immediately and asked for the name and credentials of the inspector. Derek told me the committee had the authority to hire contractors as needed and that I would receive a copy of the inspection report at the hearing. I told him that showing up unannounced to measure my fence without notifying me was harassment. He said it was standard procedure. I told him I wanted the name of the contractor so I could verify he was licensed. Derek said he would pass my request to the committee, and then he ended the call. That night I got an email from the HOA with the subject line Urgent Compliance Update. It said the landscaping committee had determined that my fence posed an immediate safety and aesthetic concern, and that I was required to halt any further modifications until the hearing was complete. It also said that failure to comply would result in additional fines of $50 per day. I read the email 4 times. I had not made any modifications. The fence had been finished for weeks. This was a manufactured emergency designed to create a paper trail that made me look non-compliant. I replied to the email and copied the management company. I wrote that I had made no modifications, that the fence had been completed according to the approved design, and that I expected the false safety claim to be retracted immediately. I attached the same 12 photos I had sent with my hearing request. I also attached a screenshot of the email timestamp showing that the HOA had sent the urgent notice at 9:47 in the evening, which violated their own policy that official correspondence must be sent during business hours. I hit send and knew Melissa would see it within minutes. She called me at 6 in the morning. My phone rang, and I answered half asleep. "This is Melissa Thomas, from the Landscaping Committee," she said. "You are in violation of the stop work order, and we have documentation proving you continued construction after the notice was issued." I sat up and turned on the light. I told her I had not touched the fence since it was installed, and that I had photographic proof of the timeline. She said the inspector had observed fresh hardware, and that I was lying. I told her I would see her at the hearing, and I hung up. My hands were shaking. This was not about the fence anymore. This was about control. Melissa wanted to prove she could make me fold under pressure, and she was willing to fabricate evidence to do it. If you are enjoying this story, please hit like and subscribe so I can keep bringing you more HOA nightmare content. I spent the next 2 days gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I printed the approval letter, the survey report, the contractor invoice, the inspection certificate from the city building department, and the original HOA bylaws highlighting the fence regulations. I organized everything in a 3-ring binder with labeled tabs. I also pulled the security camera footage from my doorbell, showing Melissa trespassing in my backyard to take photos. The timestamp was clear, and the angle showed her stepping over the property line and crouching near the back fence. I burned the footage to a USB drive and labeled it with the date and time. I also reached out to the mail carrier who delivers to my street. His name is Roy, and he had been working this route for 8 years. I caught him one afternoon while he was sorting mail at the curb, and I asked if he had ever seen Melissa posting notices on doors in the neighborhood. He laughed and said she posted notices almost every week. He told me she had a stack of pre-printed violation forms in her car, and she would stick them on doors without even knocking. He said he had seen her post 3 notices on the same house in one day, just to make a point. I asked if he would be willing to write a statement, and he said he would think about it. 2 days later, he handed me a signed letter describing what he had witnessed. I added it to the binder. The hearing was held in the management company lobby on a Thursday evening. The room was small and fluorescent lit, with a folding table at the front and a row of plastic chairs facing it. Melissa was already seated at the table with 2 other board members I recognized from neighborhood emails. The HOA president was a man in his 60s named Carl, who always wore a tie even at weekend events. The treasurer was a woman named Linda, who ran the neighborhood watch and sent daily crime alert emails about suspicious cars parked on the street. Melissa sat in the middle with a thick binder of her own and the same clipboard she had been carrying for weeks. Derek from the management company was also there taking notes. He sat off to the side with a laptop and avoided eye contact. There were 3 other homeowners in the chairs behind me, and I recognized one of them as the guy Melissa had cited for the truck. He was there to watch her lose. Carl started the meeting by reading a statement about HOA authority and the importance of community standards. Then he turned it over to Melissa. She opened her binder and pulled out a stack of photos. She said my fence exceeded the maximum height, that the color was not the approved shade, and that I had ignored multiple warnings to correct the violations. She said the inspector had confirmed the height was 75 inches at the tallest point, and that the setback was only 2 feet 6 inches. She said I had continued construction after the stop work order, and that new hardware had been observed during the follow-up inspection. She said the association had no choice but to enforce the fine and require me to remove the fence entirely. I said almost nothing, because silence makes people talk. I waited until she finished, and then I opened my binder. I pulled out the approval letter and slid it across the table. "This is the written approval from the Architectural Committee," I said. "It specifies a 6-foot cedar privacy fence stained natural brown with a 3-foot setback." I pulled out the survey report and slid it next to the letter. "This is the survey showing the fence is 3 feet 2 inches from the property line." I pulled out 12 photos and laid them in a row. These are dated photos showing the fence height at 71 inches, measured with a tape measure at 6 different points. I pulled out the city building inspection certificate. This is the city sign-off confirming the fence meets all local codes. Melissa tried to interrupt and I held up my hand. I pulled out the doorbell camera USB drive. "This is footage of you trespassing in my backyard to take photos without permission," I said. "The timestamp matches the date you submitted your first complaint." I pulled out Roy's letter. This is a statement from the postal carrier describing your pattern of posting violation notices without verification. Then I pulled out the email chain where Derek had admitted the notice date was wrong. The management company sent the urgent compliance notice outside of business hours, which violates your own policy. Every claim in your violation notice is factually incorrect, and I have documentation proving it. Carl looked at Melissa, and Melissa looked at the photos. She picked up one of the pictures and stared at it like she could will the measurement to change. "That is not a certified tape measure," she said. I told her the city inspector had used the same measurement and certified the fence compliant. She said the inspector must have made a mistake. I told her I also had the contractor's invoice showing the exact materials and dimensions. She said contractors lie. I told her I had the survey company's contact information if the board wanted to verify the property line. She said surveys could be faked. Linda leaned forward and asked Melissa if she had actually measured the fence herself, or if she had relied on visual estimates. Melissa said the inspector had done the measurements. Linda asked for the inspector's report. Melissa said it was still being finalized. Carl asked when the report would be available. Melissa said she did not know. Carl asked if the inspector was licensed. Melissa said she assumed so. Carl asked for his name and company. Melissa said she would have to look it up. I pulled out one more document. "This is a confirmation from the city clerk," I said. "I contacted them last week to verify the zoning ordinance that Melissa cited in her violation notice. According to the clerk, the ordinance Melissa referenced does not exist. She misrepresented city law in writing to justify this enforcement action." I slid the letter across the table and Carl picked it up. He read it slowly, and his expression changed. He looked at Melissa and asked her where she had gotten the ordinance number. She said she had copied it from an old file. He asked her if she had verified it. She said she did not think she needed to. I reveal it right when Karen tries to interrupt, so she cannot control the room. Melissa tried to cut in and say the ordinance was a clerical error and that the height violation was still valid, but Carl held up his hand and told her to stop talking. He said the board needed to review the evidence and that the hearing would be continued to a later date. Melissa's face went red and she started to argue, but Linda cut her off. "We will reconvene after we have verified the inspector's credentials and reviewed the city clerk's letter," Linda said. "This meeting is adjourned." The room emptied fast. The other homeowners left first, and Melissa sat at the table, staring at her binder. I packed up my documents and walked out. Derek caught me in the parking lot and asked if I had copies of everything. I told him I had already sent a full package to the management company by certified mail. He nodded and said he would make sure the board received it. Then, he got in his car and left. 2 days later, I got a call from a tow truck driver named Gene. He said he had been contracted by the HOA to remove vehicles from the neighborhood, and that Melissa had been calling him multiple times a day, trying to get him to tow cars that were not actually in violation. He said she had sent him photos of my truck parked in my own driveway, and claimed it was abandoned. He said he had refused the job because the vehicle was clearly registered and legally parked, and that she had threatened to report him to the association for non-compliance. He said he was done working with the HOA, and that he wanted me to know Melissa was trying to weaponize every vendor she could reach. I thanked him, and asked if he would be willing to put that in writing. He said he already had. He had sent a letter to the management company, and the board explaining that he was terminating his contract because the landscaping committee was making fraudulent tow requests. He said 2 other contractors had done the same thing in the past month. Melissa was burning through vendors faster than the association could replace them. I filed a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory office. Massachusetts requires associations to follow specific procedures for enforcement actions, and I had documentation showing the HOA had violated multiple rules. I attached the hearing transcript request, the city clerk letter, the doorbell footage, Roy's statement, and Gene's letter. I also attached proof that the stop work order had been issued outside business hours and that the inspector had never provided credentials. I sent the complaint certified mail and kept copies of everything. The board called an emergency meeting 2 weeks later. The email went out to all homeowners with the subject line Special Cessionary Enforcement Policy. I showed up and the room was packed. Carl and Linda were at the front table, but Melissa was not there. Carl started by saying the board had reviewed my complaint and the documentation I had provided. He said the landscaping committee had acted outside its authority in several areas, and that the violation notice issued to me was being withdrawn. He said the fine was canceled, and that I would receive a written apology from the association. Then he said the board was adopting a new enforcement checklist that required all violation notices to include photographs, measurements, and citations to specific bylaws before they could be issued. He said all contractor inspections would require advance notice to the homeowner, and that all inspectors would be required to provide credentials and a written report within 48 hours. He said the stop work authority was being limited to genuine safety emergencies, and that any future misuse would result in removal from the committee. Linda added that the board was reviewing all enforcement actions from the past year, and that any homeowner who believed they had been unfairly cited could request a rehearing. She said the management company would be required to maintain a public log of all violations and resolutions, so homeowners could verify that the process was being followed correctly. Carl said Melissa had submitted her resignation from the landscaping committee and that the board had accepted it. He said she would remain a homeowner, but would no longer have any enforcement authority. The room was silent for about 5 seconds, and then someone in the back started clapping. The applause spread, and Carl looked uncomfortable, but he did not try to stop it. After the meeting, I walked out to the parking lot, and Roy was waiting by the curb. He handed me a newspaper clipping from the local weekly. It was a short article about HOA disputes in Worcester, and it mentioned the landing at Harborview Village by name. The article said a vendor had filed a formal complaint alleging that a board member had attempted to coerce fraudulent service orders, and that the state regulatory office was investigating. The vendor was Jean, and the board member was Melissa. The article also said 2 other contractors had severed ties with the association in the past month due to similar issues. Roy told me the story had been picked up by a regional contractor forum, and that several companies had added the HOA to an internal blacklist. No one wanted to work for an association that weaponized service calls and threatened vendors who refused to participate in harassment campaigns. The board was going to have a hard time finding anyone willing to bid on landscaping or maintenance contracts until they cleaned up their reputation. The next week, I got a letter from the management company. It was a formal apology signed by Carl and Linda. It said the board regretted the errors in the enforcement process and that they were committed to ensuring all homeowners were treated fairly going forward. It also said my file had been cleared of all violations and that no record of the incident would remain in the association's database. The letter included a check for $200 reimbursing me for the cost of the survey and the certified mail fees. I cashed the check and put the letter in the binder with everything else. I also updated my insurance company with the final inspection certificate and the board's apology letter. They closed my case and confirmed my premium would remain unchanged. Melissa's tactics collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. She had insisted on a deadline, and the timestamp proved she lied. The state investigator contacted me a month later and asked for copies of my documentation. I sent everything, and he said my complaint had been instrumental in identifying a pattern of procedural violations. He said the HOA was now under enhanced oversight, and that any future complaints would trigger an automatic audit. The board adopted an enforcement checklist that limited Karen tactics. Every violation notice now required photographic evidence, precise measurements, and a written explanation of which bylaw was being violated. The checklist also required the committee to notify homeowners in advance of any inspections, and to provide copies of all evidence at least 48 hours before a hearing. The new rules made it nearly impossible for anyone to manufacture violations the way Melissa had. Karen's credibility collapsed in front of witnesses. Melissa stopped attending board meetings and neighborhood events. I saw her once at the grocery store, and she turned around and walked the other way. Roy told me she had put her house on the market. Linda told me the board had quietly settled 2 other complaints from homeowners who had been targeted by Melissa, and that the legal fees had been significant. A state procedure complaint that forced the HOA to respond was the leverage I needed. The regulatory office does not have enforcement power over fines or bylaws, but it can require associations to produce records and explain their procedures. The board knew that failing to cooperate would result in public scrutiny and potential legal exposure. The complaint turned my personal dispute into a systemic accountability issue. and the board had no choice but to take it seriously. A vendor blacklists the HOA after Karen is caught ordering staged photos, and the board has to scramble for contractors. Jean's letter was the breaking point. Once the contractor forum picked up the story, the association became toxic in the local vendor network. The board had to issue public statements distancing themselves from Melissa and promising reforms just to get bids on basic maintenance work. The reputational damage was worse than any fine. My fence is still standing. Every panel is level, every post is plumb, and every measurement is exactly where it should be. The survey markers are gone, but I kept one as a reminder. It sits on my kitchen counter next to the binder. I look at it sometimes when I am filling out benefits paperwork, and I remember that even the most aggressive tyrant can be beaten with patience and documentation. The neighborhood is quieter now. People still complain about mailboxes and shrubs, but the enforcement process has slowed down, and the board is more careful about following procedures. The landing at Harborview Village Association is still an HOA, and it still has rules, but it no longer feels like a hostile occupation. I can sit in my backyard without worrying that someone is taking photos over the fence. I can park in my driveway without checking for tow trucks. I can live in my house without constantly looking over my shoulder. I will bring you another story soon.